You aware of some of the new laws that were passed in Sacramento that might have a major impact on how things will be done in the state? Stay tuned. We'll talk about some of those laws on Talking with Henrietta coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. California State Assembly member Mark Berman, who represents part of San Mateo County and Santa Clara County, wrote in one of his district newsletters that 2018 was an historic year in Sacramento, since the California State Legislature passed major bills to protect the environment, voting rights, and voter information. It also passed one of the strongest campaign finance disclosure laws in the nation. On this show, we'll look at some of the major bills that were signed into law in 2018 and this year, and how they might affect us. My guest is Regina Wolfson, who is the Executive Director of California Black Media. Ms. Wolfson works in Sacramento and has served in her current position since 2013. Prior to her current position, she served as a communications consultant with the California State Board of Education for 3 years. Well, welcome, Regina. Thanks so much for joining me. It's a pleasure having you.
And thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, let's start with California Black Media. What is the organization all about?
Well, California Black Media is a nonprofit that my father, my mother, and several other publishers, Black media publishers, started back in I think it was like 2002. And they started really essentially putting their eyes and focus at state government, state rules, regulations. And it was an advocacy organization that wasn't, I think they went through different iterations of what it kind of, what it was going to do in terms of looking at their fair share of dollars that were coming throughout the state, making sure that these communities that they serve through their newspapers and media outlets were getting the information. We're also getting the paid dollars that go with that information, and making sure that they were just better connected so that people could be engaged in their government, not just at a state level, but really being able to understand what it means to them at a local level. And in 2013, I had the opportunity to take over the organization after my stint in government. I was appointee for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and stayed a little bit underneath Brown's administration. So I got to see government at its highest level in the state.
Before you keep on, you were saying that in 2013, you were an appointee of Governor Schwarzenegger's.
Yes.
Was this for the California State Board of Education?
Yes. So when I got appointed, I worked for the Secretary of Education, then went over to the State Board of Education and did some work while I was at the State Board of Education. And they had me moonlight 2 jobs at the time, because that's whenever the state was going through the financial crisis. And we were going through that crisis, and so people were going on furloughs, and so I was picked up to work on the census, and so I then led statewide outreach efforts in schools, faith-based community, as well as work with ethnic media.
So it seems that you have a lot of experience when it comes to working in Sacramento, working in the governor's office, and working with legislators.
I have my fair share of experience. I wouldn't say I'm a pro, but I do know a fair share of people. I am, this government is so large that I don't know that you'll ever feel that you'll fully know everything, but I definitely, I'm very familiar with how some things work in the Capitol, and constantly learning. So, I've been around this for a while, and that's why it was such a natural fit when my father asked me to take over California Black Media. He thought it would be a natural fit for me to take it over and be able to help California Black Media go into the next generation and the next level where we've been taking it now.
Sure. Now, obviously, you would be a natural for it since it's within your family. And you've talked about the history. So what is the organization doing now?
So the organization, when I took over in 2013, I really had to kind of figure out, I've never run a statewide organization, I've never run a nonprofit. And so, I really had to look at what was going on in the industry, understanding what was missing and what the gaps for opportunities were, and then really trying to find the niche of where California Black Media could help bridge the gap. And what I recognize is that I don't care what city council meeting you go to, even county board office, local school board meetings, unless there's something really, really hot and juicy on the agenda, people just don't show up. But they don't realize that decisions are being made, and they're being made, and until they are upset. The reason why they're upset is they show up because decisions were made, meetings, or maybe even years before, and nobody was watching it. And so I have had an opportunity, like I said, to work at some of the highest levels and watch how communication plays a role in government, in engagement, and how people get informed. And I took that and said, I think there's a place for California Black Media. And so we've evolved, and I think that we're going to continue to evolve. But we are, we're an advocacy organization, so we advocate. I think that one of the things that I'm really, really proud to say is that no matter where I go, people are like, we know who California Black Media is. There's so many people.
Is it primarily a Sacramento-based organization?
Oh no, we're statewide. So while we're based here in Sacramento, we work with media outlets that are African American owned throughout the state. So if you're an audience and you're an African American owned media outlet, we pretty much are helping provide what we saw that there was a gap in information and people really understanding how some of this stuff works, and it's complex. So we have developed a news bureau that is still forming, it is still growing. We've gone through our growing pains of having good, journalists and then not so good reporting. Right now, I believe we're on fire with the reporting that has been coming out. And what we do is we look at issues that will impact the African American community, and it may impact everyone.
Sure.
But we say, how does it impact the African American community?
Sure. Now, it's interesting. You said that the organization is growing. Now, many media outlets throughout this country are suffering because of the internet. So how is it that California Black Media happens to be growing and the news bureaus seem to be prospering? How is the organization funded?
So the organization is funded because I have to go out and hustle. So that's the first thing. We get grants.
So it's a nonprofit.
So we're a nonprofit. And what we're doing is, while the news and the internet has shaken things up, the one thing that people still want is good quality information. Good quality information is, there's no shortage of that. And being able to articulate how these policymakers are making decisions that will impact everyone else's life, I think that there's no shortage of that. And right now, philanthropy is actually throwing a lot of money in news organizations. I'm not saying that we're getting any of it, but we have been on the receiving end of some great grants that have allowed us to continue to do our work and thrive. And what we're doing is I take every opportunity to jump on that and build on it. So when I say that the industry and that what we're doing is growing, it's because people want us to be able to articulate. People don't want a press release. People want us to be able to take a story and be able to tell people, what does this mean? So, for instance, school education numbers have just come out. And while we haven't really looked at it, we have just started contracting with a new education reporter who's going to be excellent. His first story, which we're hoping will be out next week or the week after, he's analyzing the data so that we can then look at this data and say, what does it mean to African American families?
Okay, now, Regina, let's kind of save that one for just a little later as we talk about some of the legislation that comes out. And before we actually get to talking about the legislation, I just want to mention there was a conference that ethnic media representatives went to in Sacramento. That was about February, March. I think that was in March. February. Okay, and we have a photo of that. And if you could talk something about that conference, because I think you were very instrumental
so
in
California
facilitating
Black Media
that.
Every year, California Black Media has partnered with the California Newspaper Publishers Association, which is the mainstream dailies, big dailies. And I have partnered, brought in ethnic media services with Sandy Close, who you know, and Arturo Carmona, who has also been working with the Latino community, and we're bringing all the ethnic media to the table. And that conference, we helped sponsor the day where we talked about the census. And the picture that you're referring to, I think that right after that I had arranged a meeting with some of the governor's top advisors to talk about the census.
Now let me interrupt you because you can't see that picture, and you talked about bringing ethnic media to the table. And this picture shows some of us, myself included, sitting around the table. And you mentioned Sandy Close, and she's here in purple jacket. You can't see her, but I'm sure you're familiar with the with the particular picture. And there is this conference going on in terms of the census. So continue to talk about that, because we later have a photo of some of the ethnic media reporters after a conversation, a discussion with the governor and his staff, and you did get into that.
Yeah, so that conference was really about bringing us together, talking about kind of the state's plan and rollout for the 2020 census and making sure that we were going to get ready. Obviously, at that time, there was a lot of controversy around the federal government's role in what was happening to scare residents from wanting to fill out the census. And so we thought it was really important to make sure that our communities were at the table early on during the transition of the governor, and since we were, handing this off to a new governor, but making sure that the investment that California made a $187 million investment to ensure that we are able to, make sure that residents know why the census is important, that the census is safe, and that they should fill it out so that we can get our fair share back of our resources that we send to the federal government for all those great programs that help so many communities thrive and help businesses decide where they're going to locate and where they're going to be. So we really, use that conference as an opportunity to bring ethnic media to the table.
Okay, so we see some of the photo. We see some of the representatives in the photo. So talk about what communities are represented in ethnic media. I know there's India, Vandana Kumar from India Currents, and do you know of a few other
Native
ethnicities?
Americans. We brought a Native American contingency together and had, I think, about 12 media outlets come into the governor's office. You guys, that was a different day. They didn't come on that particular day, but Sandy helped organize that.
We went directly from the luncheon.
Latino community, obviously, many of the African American publications that are here throughout the state, many of them all were represented, and the API community was represented, and so we, strive to make sure that we're inclusive.
Sure, we can see the next photo. We can see the next photo.
Oh, you can? Okay. We
And the
tried to
next
make
photo,
sure.
I should tell you, since you're not here in the studio, the next photo shows you standing with some of the ethnic media reporters right after the conference
Oh, okay,
with some
yeah,
of the
right after
governors,
yeah, at the
governor's
Capitol.
staff. And it's a photo I missed out on because I tarry to ask a question of the governor's staff members.
Oh, yeah.
So you're here, and do you remember anything about that staff meeting?
I just remembered, I mean, the governor's office really wanted to hear, what were the concerns. They wanted to make sure that our voices were not left out. They understood we were trusted messengers, an important part of that conversation. And as I've said, as the governor has people in his office that do believe in ethnic media and our importance, the importance and the role that we play in educating the community.
It seems that certainly the governor happens to be listening, and some of the legislators are listening with some of the legislation that had been passed. And we can go on, we can drop that particular picture and go on to talk about some of the actual legislation. For example, there's AB 392, Regina, the California Act to Save Lives. So
Yes.
could you say something about that particular bill that was passed?
Yeah, so AB 392 was a very, it was a contentious bill because law enforcement felt as though they were being attacked, and you had vulnerable Black and brown communities that also felt like they were being attacked. And so this was a courageous, and ambitious legislation. It ended up being where law enforcement dropped their concerns about the bill, but they for sure. I mean, it went through the year before. It didn't go anywhere. It died, and then it came back kind of in a different form, and concessions had to be made to get them to a place of being able to have the governor sign it. But I think one of the things the governor said was, this is not the thing that's going to, for lack of better words, be the silver bullet to stop the kind of unlawful acts that I don't want to even call them unlawful acts, but it's not going to possibly be the silver bullet, but it's something that we need to do as a start and have that start of that conversation of bringing these communities together. And so I think that it was one of those days that was a really historic day.
Sure.
In
Now we
eyes
have
of so many advocates that have been fighting for reform.
We have a photo from that. If we could use that photo, it's of the governor right after the signing of the bill, and it's the next photo that's in line that we could see. Yeah, that's it. And so you might be, I'm sure you're familiar with the photo because it was, there was an article that appeared that we even used in the East Palo Alto Today newspaper, where the governor is surrounded by supporters of the bill. And the idea is that it would lessen some of the shootings of young men in this country, especially young Black men in this country.
Yeah. So that's the thought behind it, and the intention, and that's I want to say it was over 100-year-old law, so they were looking at really trying to work to try to change that, and so they got to a place where this law will be in place, and the advocates felt like, hey, we didn't get everything we wanted, but it was a start, and they were okay with that, and law enforcement backed off of their opposition to the particular law.
In fact, what was very interesting in it was that there was some support from the law enforcement community.
Right.
So it seems.
I think it was the DA. I think it were certain DAs in certain communities were okay with it, but I don't know that it had wide support of law
Sure.
enforcement.
We can go to a two-shot if we could, for the most part, stay on a two-shot of myself and Regina. So, Regina, the next bill that was very influential, that might have been also very controversial, was one related to charter schools. So, could
Yeah.
you talk about the bill relating to charter schools and why that was so important?
So you're probably referring to 1505. That particular bill, just, charter schools had a very ambitious plan to, they wanted to start with putting a moratorium on charter schools. And the Charter Schools Association obviously was not, excited about that at all. This also was one of those bills where they had the law hasn't really been tinkered with in the last 30 years. And so these particular changes helped everybody to kind of understand the rules of the road. It still allowed, there was compromises that had to be made with, charter schools not being able to operate outside of their district. They couldn't appeal all the way to the state board. So there's certain things that change that process, but they still have due process because they'll be able to, if they get a vote of no confidence or what have you, a rejection at a local district, they're still able to appeal to a county office of education. So there was some give and take. There were lots of negotiations. My understanding, I wasn't involved in them, but I heard about the different negotiations and how it almost didn't happen. But I'm glad to see that that people are kind of being forced to have these conversations, even though they're difficult, and people have to do some give and take on both sides.
Now, it's very interesting, if I can stop you for a moment. In the East Palo Alto community, the local community in which I operate, in the East Palo Alto Today newspaper covers, the charter schools are controversial because they pull away funding from the public schools.
Right.
And since the public schools are funded by the number of students who attend on a daily basis, the less students attend, the more public money
how much money
the school system loses. So in that way, it weakens the public schools. So I find it was very interesting that these are bills that were passed into law that gave more power to charter schools.
Well, they didn't really give more power to charter schools. What they did is, local districts are going to be able to look at, like, one of the things that they said is, hey, everybody has to have a, credentialed teacher. I want to tell you, good charter schools, what we should be doing is good charter schools, our public schools should be learning from them. The reason California Black media covered this area so heavily is because numbers that came out that looked at these are no-lie numbers. These are state numbers. 80% of African American students across the board, no matter what socioeconomic status they had, they weren't able to do math at grade level. 68% are able to read at grade level. That is something that really becomes a state of an emergency. And for a organization like ours and businesses that we support and are advocating for, they need people who can read.
So I do have some of those figures in front of me that in California, 68% of all African American students are performing below their grade level in English, and about 80% are falling behind in terms of math proficiency.
Right.
And 71% of African American high school seniors in California earned a diploma in 2017 compared to 93% of Asian students. And some of the statistics show that some of those charter schools were really making a difference in terms of showing higher grade level marks for minority students, African American students.
Yeah. I mean, and some are. The ones that are, I mean, the funny part for us, really, in terms of covering this, nobody kind of talks about it, is that when you talk about local control and you talk about school board members, the reality is they should be putting charters that are not meeting the mark, they're not meeting what their charter, what they were aimed to do. Those are charters that shouldn't be in this. They shouldn't be there educating kids or not educating kids. But we have to do something as it relates to this, because you can't continue to have those type of numbers.
So,
and
if I can just interrupt to ask the crew, we do have a photo from one of the conferences on education levels and charter schools. So if you could bring up that photo, that would be the next photo that then we could talk about the conference itself. Yes, so we have a photo. And you know something about that conference because you, California Black Media, wrote an article relating to it. Do you remember it?
Which conference was this?
This was the one that took place. Tanu Henry wrote it about California charter schools bringing hard data. So we were talking about some of that data.
Right, yeah. So I believe that I think they did a town hall. And so I think I think what you're probably referring to is a town hall they did with Roland Martin. And they were bringing the data and the facts to the community. And I think it was eye-opening for us as news organizations, because it's data that you could not deny. So the question that we had to have is a difficult question for educators and people that are in the system. What are you doing about it?
Yes.
And it can't be, well, we need more money. It has to be, how are people who have less, who have those, the schools that are typically raggedy and broke down, how is it that they are exceeding even with less? And so it's a catch-22, because there's people who will misquote information. They'll say charter schools aren't public schools, charter schools cherry pick. What happens is people are looking for their kids a different option. And for the charter schools that may be open and designed to do certain things, the families are looking for it. And yes, that means that if families are not looking for that, are left in, overwhelmingly, I guess, maybe left into the traditional public school, it means that, schools have to say, wait a second, what do I have to do?
Yes.
What do I have to do to make sure that this system is attractive, other than saying I'm going to trap you in a school and not make sure that you're being educated?
Well, it seems you bring up a very good point that perhaps there is a lot from charter schools, the good charter schools, that public schools could learn from. Now, there is also the bill that would force those interested in running for office to reveal their taxes in order to be on the ballot. Are you familiar with that particular bill?
So I am, and the very interesting part about that bill is that I believe that the Supreme, I want to say, I think it was ruled unconstitutional. So I think we did it, and I just read an op-ed about it. We didn't write about it, but it was Brown. I believe it was brought up with Brown a couple of times. He vetoed it, and partially he vetoed it because it was kind of going after a political party, and it was, I guess they ended up deeming it unconstitutional, and that the states didn't have the right to kind of put a recommendation or a qualification. It wasn't the state's role to be able to do that.
Well,
so
at least
it actually got rejected.
However, didn't Governor Newsom sign it into law?
He did,
and the Trump administration
he did, and then it got
recently
rejected. And I don't want to really speak. I mean, I have to go back and look this up, but I know that I just read an article. I believe it was in the LA Times, and George Skelton just wrote about it, and he did a column that kind of said, anybody like California keeps. I think it was kind of like California keeps delivering Donald Trump the blessings or something like that. There was something to that effect.
Yes, and what it was, as I recall, that it would be a way of forcing any candidate, new political candidate, to release his taxes before his or her name could go on the ballot.
Right,
And
but it got rejected. So that particular piece, though,
I think the Trump administration challenged it.
It wasn't the Trump administration that challenged it. I'm actually working to pull it up right now. But, yeah, so it was, a federal judge ruled last week that Democrat legislators and Gavin Newsom had no business trying to strong-arm Trump into publicly releasing his income tax returns as a condition to appear on the California presidential primary ballot. A U.S. District Judge Morrison England Jr. shredded the Democrats' rationale and the gotcha legislation. He ruled it unconstitutional on 3 counts.
So we won't
issued a temporary injunction blocking the first in the nation law.
So we won't be seeing that one.
So yeah, so basically we did it, and the legislature, the governor did it, and a judge came back and said it was unconstitutional. So. So it's basically going to be invalid.
So I wonder if the state could then appeal the judge's decision. The article probably doesn't go that far.
I don't know if it goes as far as saying that it can appeal, but they talked about Jerry Brown basically saying why he vetoed it, and the many times, I guess, that it came up underneath Jerry Brown, but he also refused to release his own taxes when he was running for president in 1992.
Oh, did he really?
And for governor in 2010 and 2014.
In all of those years?
He just said it was a slippery slope, is what Governor Brown's veto message was.
He didn't release his own taxes.
Yeah, Governor Jerry Brown did not release his own taxes.
So it would be consistent for him to veto the bill.
So it was consistent for him to do it, but he said what would be next, like one of the veto messages, what would be next? Brown asked in his veto message, 5 years of health records, a certified birth certificate, high school report card, and so...
well, those were some of the things Trump was asking of Obama, his birth certificate, his graduation records. So
Right. So it's ironic, but I think that what happened is, obviously Trump was just saying it as a citizen, but when you're trying to put it into law, I think that that's where, they kind of said this is a slippery slope, and, Governor Brown didn't do it, so he said no. And basically, you have a judge who's basically said it's unconstitutional.
Well, we'll have to see where that goes. Now, there is one, as newspaper people, that affects newspapers, and that was AB 170. And can you talk about that?
Yeah, so AB 170 really came about around AB 5. AB 5 was the law that was really codifying a Supreme Court decision, a California Supreme Court decision called Dynamex. And that law was basically a trucking company who misclassified its workers, had its workers at one point, and then turned around and turned them into independent contractors, but didn't change anything. They basically had to wear a uniform, and they were still told when to do whatever it was that they were doing. They didn't meet the test of being an independent contractor. And so that set in motion a entire frenzy. Once that decision was, once that decision happened, it created, okay, now we can go after Uber and Lyft, we can go after the gig economy, and really kind of upend the, workers that in some cases could be probably misclassified, but in other cases, how you had to redefine that classification. And so that was a very intense bill that made its way through the legislature.
Now,
and you probably saw the protests.
Didn't that end up saying that newspaper deliverers were not independent contractors?
Right. So...
And independent newspaper deliverers, in many cases, are in fact independent contractors.
Well, I think it depends on how you classify them. I will say ethnic media, I made a plea. So AB5, all of that, you had AB5 and you had a lot of businesses that if they were early on and had great lobbyists, they were getting carve-outs. So doctors had carve-outs. Insurance agents got carve-outs.
So
AAA got carve-outs. They get to do their business model the way that they've been doing their business model.
Now,
So
when you say that word you're using, is it carved out or carved it out?
Carve.
C-A-R-V-E, carved out.
Yes.
Which means that they wouldn't apply, the law wouldn't apply to them, they would be independent contractors?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So the law won't apply to them. They were able to be carved out. So everybody, was clamoring for carve-outs. Uber and Lyft were clamoring for carve-outs because they said our business models, these folks are not employees. And so the legislature, didn't agree with that, I guess, and, they didn't get a carve-out. So now there's a $90 million ballot initiative looming to see what it is that they may or may not do, because come January 1, people are either going to have to be employees or they're going to be laying off a whole bunch of people, or basically disabling an app for a lot of different industries and a lot of different people. And
that applies to Uber and Lyft now?
That will now apply to Uber and Lyft. And so to give you a little bit more background, AB5, there were different people who got carve-outs. Well, in the 11th hour, when we realized that there were things that were going to affect the news industry between, even how many journalists. Right now, we have a carve-out of 35 freelancers. So California Black Media uses freelance journalists. I can only use that person. They can only submit to me 35 times before I would have to turn them into an employee.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Never
so
mind.
Never
mind that they might be freelancing and they're also working out of their own house.
Right. That doesn't matter. So there's that carve out. And I think, too, the law, we're trying to figure out what it's going to mean come January so that we're in compliance, obviously. But not just that, photographers, too. So they can do 35 submissions before I would have to turn them into an employee. So that's going to create a very different dynamic for us. We're still trying to work through what that's going to look like in this space and in this environment. But when they got to the newspaper carriers,
now, Regina,
that's when we wrote the op-ed.
Regina, before you go further, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Does it matter whether the photographer or the reporter makes 35 submissions consecutively? Suppose it was 3 months apart. It
just says 35 submissions. So I don't know if they were being vague. I don't know. To be honest with you, we are going to have to work with, there's a whole collective group of people who have been working to look at this, and we're hoping to, piggyback on understanding from, other lawyers that can help us look at the law to say what it is, how we're going to keep track of it, and how and if we are able to treat them, if we have to turn them into employees. Or if we have to count that you get to 35, and once you're at 35, I can't do business with you, or I don't know.
Or you have a constant pool of freelancers. I'm thinking if you could use each person, I don't know, more infrequently, and use, have a bigger pool of people. But it doesn't make sense if, I was going to say, if they're not working directly in your office and they might be writing infrequently, once every 6 months or so, it's hard to classify them as employees.
Right. So, I imagine that, but I think that, we're going to have to look at the law and just try to figure out how, with the best legal counsel, what that really is going to mean for us.
Sure, and so now you're lobbying legislators.
Well, we're not lobbying legislators. What we've done, because obviously we're a nonprofit, so we don't lobby, but we do try to talk about the effects that this will have on even our nonprofit. There were nonprofits that were crying out saying, we're a nonprofit, and as you know how nonprofits are, you don't have stable funding all the time.
Sure, that's
so
true.
It's crazy to try to say you have to, have payroll taxes and not be able to, there was just no wiggle room for that. Even nonprofits. Nonprofits are, if you said, I have somebody who comes in and does certain stuff for us, they may not be covered by that. You may, depending on, the rest of your test, if they're free to work whenever they want to, you have to really look at everything that would make them free at being able to take on other clients and not be under your control, and really do a test on if they feel like you're treating them like an employer, if they're
so
really a contractor.
I'd like to get a distinction from you, because you said as a nonprofit you can't lobby, but
Right.
then you can advocate, right? So what's
You
the
can
difference?
advocate, right.
What's the difference?
Yeah, so the difference of advocating is not going in and saying, hey, we want you to sign this bill, we want you to do this, going and actually talking to legislators. What I did recently is normally I would never really take a side, obviously, just from being in journalism. I try to look at both sides, and we try to make sure we're producing balanced journalism. But when I knew that it was going to hurt the industry, that's when I used my voice, and I didn't even call any legislators. They read about it because so many people were writing about it or publishing the article. So when all of our media partners started publishing the editorial that I wrote, it really spoke to what was going on in the industry, and not just the African American industry, but the Latino industry, and anybody who was printing a weekly publication and had to worry about distribution, and this is how they get their livelihood.
I think it would be most newspapers, a lot of newspapers throughout this country, and in California, in Palo Alto, for instance.
Yeah.
Some major newspapers. Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things that I want to make sure we're always treating fairly the worker, because I truly believe that. My father is the son of a sharecropper. I truly believe that we must take care of the people who are taking care of us. I believe that in the village, and I think I model that in our own organization. But I also know what our limitations are. So I'm working with people in many cases that are like, I believe in this so much, Regina, I want to do this until we get everything going the way it needs to go. Or I want to do this because I'm retired and I want to give back more time, but I need extra income. So I deal with a lot of different people, and I think that, yes, if somebody is abusing a worker, then we need to step up and make sure that that's not happening. But to destroy industries by policy changes, I think we have to really look at that. And I will say I applaud the legislature, even though it was only a 1-year reprieve. It gives us time to figure this out.
It gives time to regroup, I guess, gives time to work with to establish collaborations.
Yes.
To bring some changes. Now, talking about supporting people's rights and advocacy, what about AB 142, the bill that tackles the housing affordability crisis?
Yes, I'm not as familiar with that one, but I know that we did do a little bit of, we did write about it a little bit. I know that it puts a rent cap. I want to say that it puts some dollars. I don't know if this particular bill, because there was a whole package of bills, and $2 billion was put forth. Housing is complex in California.
Yes, it is very complex.
It is really complex because you have a lot of different agendas. You have people who are like, we don't want people in cars, but you have people who are like, I want to still be in my car. You have people who are like, I don't want to live on top of each other, but then you have people who are like, no, we need to move everybody close to transit, and everybody needs to huddle, and everybody needs to live together. And I think that, I think it's complicated. it's complicated because I've lived in inland areas, so I've lived in places where I needed my car. But today I got the chance to drive to, I mean, I didn't even have to drive. I had to go to Oakland, and I got to take the Amtrak, and it was so beautiful to take Amtrak and then, unfortunately, or fortunately, take Uber to where I had to go, and then still get back home before my kids were out of school. That was, like, beautiful because if I would have driven, that would have never been the case going from Sacramento to Oakland. So I do appreciate, having the public transit, but I also understand some of the other realities. Living in the Bay Area, if you had to live in the Bay Area, you'd have to make a lot of money right now to be able to probably survive. So,
yes, not only in terms of transportation and commuting, but also getting back to housing.
Yeah.
With apartments going up, the price of renting going up, like one bedroom, several $1,000s, having a rent cap would be something that a lot of people would appreciate, although landlords would not appreciate.
Right. Like, what's hard for me is that I do believe, and I do think that, obviously, I think anybody who's probably become wealthy in America has probably used, property to do it. I don't think that you have to be, greedy to do it. I think that many people, and I wasn't really involved with all of I knew the folks who were like, the rent can't keep going up. But I also know that there are certain things that we would be tinkering with, whether it's saying, I believe Holly Mitchell had a bill, for instance, that, and I believe the governor just signed it earlier this week, about, kind of making it so that you could not deny Section 8 housing to people. But the reality is, I guess you couldn't advertise that you would not accept it.
Sure.
But a person could come to you, and they still don't have to accept it. The problem is, in my understanding, and this was very brief, was really that homeowners are saying, I'm not going to have government come in and tell me what to do with my house, and they won't pay me on time. They won't pay me my fair market value. If something goes wrong, they won't cover it. So I think that that's kind of a slippery slope, telling someone who, has all the responsibility, but then the government's not doing
well,
its
there
part to
is
make sure that
something,
they...
Regina, there is something called rent gouging. And when
Right,
you
there is.
increase the rent 100% without any increase in services, well, then that seems to be out of balance someplace along the line. And it's now gotten to a point where even Zuckerberg is saying that Facebook has to expand into other areas because being in this area, Silicon Valley, is presenting a problem even for Facebook employees to get housing.
Right. Well, the reality is that he can do that, and we think about that, right? There's so many jobs that are centered in certain areas. Well, nobody's going to go to the Central Valley, but even if you do, you're going to start displacing people that have never owned, right? Because it's supply and demand. And so my point of saying all of that is I don't want to hurt people for saying, hey, if you tell me if I have to accept Section 8 and I raise the rent even more, then you've essentially not necessarily helped. So what I'm saying is that government has to talk to the owners of properties. We have to work out a fair solution so that they could take someone with Section 8 housing or whatever it is to get us back in line and back in play. But we also have to figure out how we're going to create better jobs and better paying jobs for people. You can't do that with 86% African Americans not being able to do math at grade level, 80% not doing it at grade level, 68% not being able to read, and think that we're going to somehow produce all these kids that now are going to get high-paying jobs to be able to afford the rent, right? Like that's not, or be able to buy. So we have to really, our system is fundamentally flawed because we're trying to fix one problem. I kind of look at it as I've made this analogy before where I look at it like it's a Rubik's Cube. You know how you're trying to get the colors all to match up? And we almost need someone who knows how to fix the Rubik's Cube, because as soon as you turn one thing, you mess up the color on the other side.
Yes,
right?
absolutely
and so
right.
we have to figure out how we're not doing that to get to the place where you're getting all the colors on the right side.
Well, it can be done. At least it has been done with the Rubik's Cube, and
It has.
there are some
I
formulas
believe that government
that
can
tell
figure
people
it
how to
out.
do it. Now, I want to mention before we go the idea that one candidate has of a guaranteed income. But before going there, are you familiar with Senate Bill 206, the Fair Pay to Play Act?
Yes, this is I think we did a headline on that, I think it was a play on Show Me the Money. Black athletes now say Show Me the Money. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
So if you can you walk us through some of that?
So, what I know about it is that this bill has been around for a while. We actually didn't get to do all of the homework to try to figure out how long this bill has been floating around the state legislature, but there were tweaks to it. And in this particular bill, I believe I think the part that kind of made it so that things would go is that student athletes weren't able to, student athletes are helping universities and the like make money. And people are making lots and lots of money. And then the student athletes, yes, they're getting a scholarship through the school. One of the things that I don't think it addressed was what happens whenever a athlete gets hurt.
Exactly.
And then they just kind of throw them out the school. So this could give them what they need, maybe in some ways, to be able to level the playing field. I get that there's getting ready to be lots of problems because the NCAA is just not happy with this at all. They say that it really crosses the line, and I think this was just one of those other big bills that says, well, we're going to change this, and California wanted to lead on this. I think it was one of those things where it was just like the right time, right people were in place. Senator Stephen Bradford out of Los Angeles co-authored the bill, and he's the vice chairman of the Legislative Black Caucus, along with Senator Nancy Skinner. And they were like, hey, we're going to look at this so that, people who are using their likeness, them dancing or what have you, that they should be able to be compensated from it. And so, that one is a to be continued. I don't know what's going to happen, but it is a to be continued to see what, sometimes you just don't even know what some of these bills are going to do until you get into them. So
well, it certainly seems fair for the student athletes. If they're making hundreds of millions of dollars for the universities, and they're not able to capitalize, and the universities are using their likenesses, and they're not able to capitalize or get any money from it whatsoever.
All that kind of stuff.
And they can't get money from any of the athleticism that they're involved in. Something seems to be wrong.
Right. And so that's how people have looked at it. And so people have said it's almost like a plantation where you're taking advantage of these people. And these students and students that are, one of the other things that I looked at is that in the black community, we have to think about, once again, with the graduation rates, with the education attainment in math and in English, we have to think about the fact that we have so many kids that's their ticket out of poverty. That's their family's ticket out of poverty. That or the music industry. So we're overrepresented in those areas. And we have to figure out how we're going to fix that. That people don't see that as their way out. It's been a way out for people, but we have to get our communities to see that so that it doesn't have to be that you can be an engineer, that you can be a doctor, I guess maybe possibly a plastic surgeon. I know some general doctors are probably like, we're not making enough money. But that they can go into these professions and make, to stop the cycle of poverty. One
last word in terms of the Fair Pay to Play Act. that the athletes, when they're at universities, are primarily putting most of their time in terms of their sports and very little, unfortunately, in the academics. And then when they're hurt, they lose the scholarship money, and then what do they have
Right.
from the service that they've provided to the college or the educational institution?
Right. I mean, I think that's one of those things that we see. I think that's I'm sure that that's part of the package and problem of why people have looked at this and said, hey, we don't have sympathy for NCAA. We understand what you're saying, not making these people be paid, how they would possibly disqualify California schools, but, we're going to see. I mean, this bill is a to be continued. I'd love to come back and talk to you about
Yes,
it, even have one of our reporters talk about it, because I do have them following it closely of what's going to be the next development.
Regina, in the closing minute or two that we have, is there something that we haven't talked about, a new bill that you could summarize very, very quickly, or something that you consider important?
Yeah, I would say that as this evening, whenever I got home, I saw that the governor actually signed another bill that, I think is going to be near and dear to anybody who has possibly been gouged with predatory lending. And it basically was, it's Bill AB 539, Assemblymember Monique Limon out of Santa Barbara. And basically it is stopping the cycle of payday lending, being able to up prices on people so that they can charge them, up to 200%.
Oh, in terms of interest rates.
So you'll see that story next week. We should have that story, and we'll be sending that story your way.
So that puts a cap on the interest rates for predatory lending.
Yes. We have documents that you'll see that we'll be sending to you that, for publishing, where people took out like a $5,000 loan and they ended up paying back $35,000 or $40,000.
Oh my gosh.
It's actually sickening. It's sickening, but it's real. They're real documents.
Well, I do know there are people in that industry who say that those who are, the people in the industry have a right to make a living.
And they do, but at that rate, it is predatory, because people don't realize that they'll come in, like let's say you come in, there'd already been a cap at $2,500, but what would happen is they would tell you, oh, but Henrietta, you qualify for $3,000, because they could charge you more on that $3,000. So they could charge you up to 200-300% on that extra $500. Because they're limited at what they could do at $2,500. So,
well, Regina, thank you so much for bringing all of this to our attention and just summarizing some major bills that have been passed. Thank you so much for the sharing, for being with us. And I'd certainly like to thank our viewers for watching. Until next time. Thank you, Regina.
Thank you.